All right, let's get straight into it. We're doing a tactical deep dive into the final, decisive phase of the Battle of Jarama. We're talking about the 6-day slugfest for one single hill, El Pingarrón, from February 18th to the 23rd, 1937. And here it is. This is the objective, El Pingarrón. Doesn't look like much, does it? Just a barren, stony hill. But it offered absolutely commanding views over the Jarama River Valley. You see, in these critical final days, if you controlled this ground, you controlled everything. You could direct artillery fire, you could stop all movement down below. This one, seemingly insignificant hill, well, it was about to become the epicenter of some of the most brutal, desperate fighting of the entire Spanish Civil War.
So where are we getting our intel for this breakdown? It's all based on the incredibly detailed historical research from the project by Cavalry Colonel F.J. Victor Rodrigo. This gives us a really solid, rigorously documented, boots-on-the-ground view of what actually happened, day by day.
Okay, here's our agenda. We're going to break this down into 5 phases. First, the overall situation, a stalled offensive. Then, the first attacks in a huge air battle. After that, we'll look at the growing Republican threat, which leads right into the climax, the all-out fight for Pingarrón. Finally, we'll wrap up with how the front stabilized and what it all means. All right, Phase 1, let's set the stage. What did the strategic picture look like in mid-February 1977?
So by this point, the big picture is stalemate. Both sides have thrown these major offensives at each other, and neither has landed a knockout blow. The lines have basically hardened into place. Franco, he knows his original plan to take the road has failed. So what happens now? The whole battle shifts gears. It becomes a brutal war of attrition. It's simple, really. The Republicans are going to try to smash through the Nationalist line, and the Nationalists are going to try to hold on for dear life.
And this is where it gets really interesting, when you look at the forces involved. Look at the Nationalist order of battle here. They're stretched thin, operating with very scarce forces. They have to manage every single man, every rifle, with extreme care. But on the other side, the Republicans have growing numbers and strong reserves. So you've got the dynamic for the whole battle right there, a smaller, veteran force dug in versus a much larger, determined enemy that just keeps getting reinforced.
Okay, let's move on to Phase 2. The first shots of this final chapter, covering the actions on February 18th and 19th. So, on the 18th, things kick off. The Republican commander, Lister, launches his first really powerful assaults right at El Pingarrón. At the same time, the whole Nationalist line just comes under incredible pressure. Now, the Nationalists, they actually managed to punch a 1-kilometer gap between 2 Republican divisions, a real opportunity. But they just don't have the reserves. There's no one to send in to exploit it. A classic case of what if.
But honestly, the real action on the 18th wasn't on the ground. It was up in the sky. We're talking about over 60 fighters, a mix of Spanish, Italian, and Soviet planes, all getting into this massive dogfight right over the battlefield. People on the ground said it was an absolutely incredible spectacle. And for the Nationalists, who'd been taking a real beating from the air, this was huge. They scored a crushing victory that day, and you can't overstate what a massive morale boost that was.
All right, fast forward to the next day, February 19th. The fighting on the ground just ramps up big time. The focus is laser-sharp on El Pingarrón. One of its outposts gets captured by Republican forces. But it's not over. The Nationalists launch not 1, not 2, but 3 violent counterassaults to take it back. This is where the battle really hardens into a nasty, brutal, close-quarters fight. In the cost, just staggering. I mean, look at these numbers. The official Nationalist report for just one day of fighting lists 132 killed and 388 wounded. That kind of attrition, that meat grinder, was just wearing both sides down to the bone, but it was hitting the outnumbered defenders especially hard. Okay, so after that intense fight on the 19th, things didn't let up. The Republican threat just kept growing. Which brings us to our next phase, and the situation on February 21st. So there was a bit of a lull on the 20th, but don't let that fool you. On the 21st, the Republicans make a major move. Their Division B pushes its entire line forward, and suddenly, they're threatening to punch right through the Nationalist positions and collapse the whole front. For the defenders, the situation just became incredibly dangerous. We're talking knife's edge here. And that sets the stage for the main event, the climax of the entire battle, the all-out assault on February 23rd. You know, the day before this final assault, the Soviet journalist Mikhail Koltsov, he just nailed the tactical reality of the situation. He wrote, El Pingarrón is the key position. Whoever dominates it will command a large stretch of the river. And that was it. That was the simple truth. Both sides knew it. Everything, absolutely everything, was going to be decided right there. So to make this happen, Leicester assembles a truly overwhelming force. We're talking 7 infantry brigades, Palov's entire tank brigade, and the concentrated fire of 8 artillery batteries, all of it aimed at one single objective. The mission couldn't have been clearer. Take El Pingarrón at any and all costs. And the day, it just unfolds with this relentless, unbelievable ferocity. At 8:30 in the morning, a massive artillery barrage just pulverizes the Nationalist defenses. By 9 o'clock, the first Republican assault goes in, and it succeeds. The position is taken. But wait, the Nationalist counterattacks start immediately. At 11 o'clock, the Republicans have to renew their assault all over again. It's this brutal, bloody back and forth that goes on all day long until the very last Republican attack is finally thrown back at 5:30 in the evening, right as the sun is going down. So let's just get this straight. The crucial point here is this. The position was conquered 3 separate times by Leicester's forces, and every single time it was retaken by Asensio's defenders in these absolutely desperate counterattacks. And get this. The guy in charge of the defense, Commander Zamalloa, he gets wounded multiple times but refuses to be evacuated. He stays right there, personally leading his men to take the line back. Incredible. So at the end of this unbelievably bloody day, the line held. The Nationalists still controlled El Pingarrón, but the cost was just immense. You can feel it in the message their commanding generals sent to Franco that night. He said, "The toughness of the day shows the enemy's interest. The exhaustion of our forces is great. They were at their absolute limit." All right, that brings us to our final section, stabilization and conclusions. What happens next? Well, after that climactic, brutal struggle on the 23rd, the Battle of Jarama was, for all intents and purposes, over. I mean, the Republicans tried one more attack a couple of days later, but it went nowhere. The front line just stabilized. It hardened into the trench systems that would pretty much define this sector for the next 2 years of the war. And the Republican chief of staff, Vicente Rojo, he later wrote that El Pingarrón could write its own history with the greatest amount of blood. What a quote. He pointed out that both sides threw their absolute best troops into this meat grinder, that they fought hand to hand, and that right there, in this one small sector, the entire Battle of Jarama was basically extinguished. Now, from the Nationalist side, you get a different but related perspective. General Quindelán, he observed that he never saw the Republican infantry fight with more grit than they did at Jarama. But, he argued, the battle had a lasting, crippling effect. In his view, their infantry never regained its offensive spirit after basically bleeding out its best shock troops in those repeated, hopeless attacks on positions like El Pingarrón. But, and this is a big but, you look at this map of the final Republican order of battle, and you realize they were far from a spent force. By the end of February, they still had around 30,000 men on this front, and just a few days later, reinforcements had already pushed that number up to nearly 40,000. So yeah, their losses were horrific, but their ability to regenerate manpower was absolutely formidable. And so that leaves us with the big final question, doesn't it? For the Nationalists, holding El Pingarrón was a clear tactical victory, a triumph of sheer bloody-minded endurance. But what about for the Republicans? They committed their very best units, their elite shock troops, and just bled them white against this one single point. So the question is, was this the place where their strategic offensive potential was ultimately broken for good? That, I think, is the key takeaway from this incredibly brutal fight.